Lois Gunn.
Good morning, Lois. We're just getting started.
Oh, okay.
So we've prayed, and I was just introducing the lesson. So this lesson is God chooses the younger twin. Our reference scripture is Genesis chapter 25. In the book it says 19b, but verse 19 is a short verse, so we're just going to say 19 to 34. Genesis 25, 19 to 34. If you have the book, it starts on page 12. I'll trust that you're utilizing the book and you'll read, some of the anecdotes that they have and some of the expository teaching that they have. But, we're going to take it in a little bit different direction as we typically do. And what I wanted to start out with, if there's anyone who would like to share, I'll open it up. But I have an example that I want to share at least. And it's talking about an example of a time where I have done many things wrong, yet it still turned out well. So if there's anyone who would like to share a story, that's fine. What you'll talk about, just any time, whether young, old, recent, way in the past, doesn't matter, where you may have done many different things wrong, but yet still in the end result turned out well. And actually, as I was pondering this thought, I was first like, well, what am I gonna talk about? Because this is what I believed God had me as I was reading through the lesson, kind of thinking about. And I was struggling at first. And then I was like, oh, okay, I'll talk about college, which is what I'm going to talk about. But then I started thinking, I'm like, oh, gosh, I remember when I was younger and I got caught stealing. I remember when I was younger and embarrassed to say this, but, this is a newer, older, different Damien, where I got caught indecently with a woman out in a young lady, I should say, out in the park. But the time I wanted to talk about specifically was college, and when I started college, I came in a cocky freshman. It's the best way I can really explain it. A lot of the classes that I was taking, I had already more or less taken those level classes in high school and passed them. So I didn't study a whole lot, and I got an okay grade point average. It was high 2 point, like 2.8, 2.9, something like that. It was okay. It wasn't great, wasn't terrible for sure. But then that work ethic stuck with me through my sophomore year, and then it came into classes that I hadn't been taking, and my grade point average then slipped, and it wasn't until later in my junior year that I started doing things a little bit better. But all throughout college, I was getting into partying, I was getting into women, young women. I was getting into things that were drinking, underage drinking. A lot of things that of those who may have gone to college tend to get into, and just creating a bad character for myself, I guess I'd say. But all the while, my mom was praying for me, and it ended up turning out well. I ended up graduating obviously on time, even though I had been on actually double probation. I was one probation away from possibly being kicked out of school. I came out with a good job, and the rest is really history. Obviously, got a loving family, got a good church, got a well-paying job. I mean, everything else is history from that point. But I did many things wrong in college, but yet because of God's mercy, because someone was praying for me, I ended up coming out, and things ended up turning out well for me despite that. And actually, as I was talking about one of the things about being caught indecently with a young lady out in public, that happened right before I started college. And there was a risk of me not even going to college. If I would have possibly gotten into any sort of legal trouble, there's a possibility that I wouldn't have been able to go to college. So just doing many things wrong in college and even leading up to college. But at any rate, does anybody else have anything that they want to share? Okay. All right, not a problem. Like I say, not an obligation. I wasn't asking necessarily for it, but sometimes it's good for us to share, not to air out our dirty laundry or anything of that nature, but for those who may be newer to faith, younger to faith, maybe going through things. It's good for us to share about our experiences and what God's brought us through, because it may be an encouragement to someone else. So that's the only reason why I mentioned it. But anyhow, the scripture that came to mind as I was preparing that is Lamentations 3:22. It says, "It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not." It was his mercies that got me through college. I wasn't a believer at that point in time. I don't believe I was saved, even though I had done a confession to Jesus Christ, and I know what the word says. It says, confess it with your mouth and believe in your heart. But I'm not sure that I believed in my heart at that time. I confessed with my mouth, but I don't know that I believed in my heart. So I don't know that I was actually saved. I certainly was out of fellowship. If at best I was out of fellowship. But anyhow, it was because his mercies and my mom praying for me, and my mom praying even when I was caught with the young lady. She was praying for me and prayed for me before I went to the probation officer that things wouldn't turn out poorly for me. It was this prayer and God's mercy that kept me. And I'm bringing this up because as we read through this lesson, you'll see that this lesson it's riddled with sin, with mistakes, with tests some that were, one that was passed, perhaps others that were not passed the way God would have wanted. And yet God's fingerprint of blessing and mercy is all throughout this story. This really, to me, is, yes, it introduces how God selected, Jacob over Esau, and how the covenant of Abraham was passed to Jacob from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, who's Israel. Yes, you see all that, but the other thing that the way that God has the things that God brought out in this lesson to me, as far as teaching and leading the discussion, was about how we don't have to be so concerned about all the mistakes that we've had, because the Bible is riddled with people of mistakes. There's only one, obviously Jesus Christ, who was mistake-free. Everybody else had tons of mistakes. And so we rely upon God's mercy, and for those that may be an unbeliever that are watching this, it's about getting into good grace, getting into that fellowship, and submitting yourselves to the will of God. Not that you're going to become mistake-free, but that because the relationship that we have with him and his election of us, we're giving many blessings that we do not deserve. Now, as we go through this, the scripture another scripture that might be remembered, obviously, is the Lord's mercies that we're not concerned, Lamentations 3:22, as we talked about, but also Acts 17:30 might be something that you may reflect upon. And it says, "And the times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent." So we'll read some mistakes and some sins that occurred, and God winked at them at that time. And that word winked at means that he didn't approve of them, but that he didn't hold them accountable to it. It's like he kind of closed his eyes for that little moment to look over, and actually that's literally what it means. It means to look over the sin that occurred. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get into the lesson. So if you're in the book, we'll be on page 13, and we're going to read Genesis chapter 25, verses 19 to 23. This section is called Jacob and Esau. I'm going to go ahead and get us started, and then the next two sections, I'll probably ask for some volunteers if you'd be so kind. So reading all of verse 19, it says, "And these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Paddan Aram, the sister to Laban the Syrian." I'm reading from the King James Version, by the way. Verse 21, "And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife, because she was barren. And the Lord was entreated of him. And Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled together within her. And she said, If it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from your bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger." All right. So the first thing want you that was brought out was Isaac. He ended up marrying his what's called first cousin once removed. I had to look up all this because you can track through the lineage where it talks about Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the sister to Laban, and that's what really kind of tripped me off. Is like Laban, later on we hear about how Jacob goes to his uncle Laban, so it's like, okay, it must be that Laban, which means, okay, if he's Jacob's uncle, then that means he has to be related to Isaac some kind of way, and that means that obviously that Rebekah has to be related some kind of way. So you go back into Genesis, I believe it's just a couple sections before. We're not going to go back to it. I think it's Genesis like 20 or something of that nature. And you find out that, or actually it's Genesis chapter 22, verses 20 to 23. You find out that as it's giving the lineage of Nahor, who was Abraham's brother, you see that Bethuel was the youngest boy or male child that was mentioned, and that Bethuel gave birth to Rebekah. So you see, okay, well, obviously we see Abraham, we know Abraham's line, and now we see that this is Nahor. So it obviously is interesting as well that we find out that Rebekah is sister to Laban, who obviously is a key figure later on in Genesis. But as I was thinking about this, like, okay, well, now that I know this, is God for close relative relationships? Does God approve of us having close relative relationships? And hopefully you understand that God is not really for it. You can actually, but this didn't come until later. In Leviticus 18:6, it says, "None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him, to uncover their nakedness. I am the Lord." So this would qualify as someone being near to kin to them. Now, there's a theory, obviously, that there weren't as many people in the world at that time, so they would have had to, marry someone that is close of kin. And I can go with that. I can appreciate that. But again, it goes back to what it said in Acts, that God winked at sin for a while. Now he would consider that sin, that we shouldn't carry out in that way. And you can even see that a lot of times when you find out, people have incestuous relationships, the children oftentimes come out with problems, whether it's some sort of handicap or otherwise. But anyhow, I digress. The next thing that I noticed was that Rebekah was barren. And this was possibly a test not only for Isaac, but also possibly for Abraham. Obviously, remember that Abraham's given the promise of God that he's going to make his offspring as the stars in the sky, right? Well, if Rebekah's barren, then how is that going to come to play? It may not have been a direct test for Abraham, but it possibly could have been an indirect test or a continuation of a test, and also a test for Isaac. I would presume, I'm sure it's pretty safe to assume that Abraham shared with Isaac the vision that God had given to him, and perhaps it's a test for both of them. At this time, let's go back a little bit. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. Now we learn in the chapter before, I think it's Genesis chapter 24, the one before we're at, we learn that he died at, I think it says 106 score and 15, or 103 score and 15, which is 175. Now at this time, he's 140 years of age, because it says in there, I just lost it. But maybe it's, in verse 19 it says, in verse 20 it says, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife. So now he's 140 years age, 100 years plus 40. So, again, and then we'll learn a little bit in the next section about how long it took, that it talks about how Isaac entreated for his wife, and the Lord was entreated by him, but this was not an immediate thing, and we'll learn that in just a minute. But I want you to notice the faith exemplified and the power of God. Isaac entreated God, and he was entreated of him. Nowadays, we have, and believe me, I'm not talking about the plight of anyone who's, particularly female, who's having fertilization issues, and I'm not ridiculing anything about what's been done, but I just know that the medical industry has some potential remedies, but they potentially cost tens of thousands of dollars, and God is still in the business and obviously capable of superseding anything that medicine can provide. Obviously through ovulation induction, through in vitro fertilization, through surrogacy, what have you. God can provide for the needs of us, as he did for Rebekah. But I'll move on. The next thing that was noteworthy to me was the contention that's brought out in the story. How it talks about the children inside of Rebekah, when she had conceived, they struggled together within her. And I looked up that word, struggle together, and understand, I think we can understand that there was some fighting, some tussling, some, rolling about inside of her, which I can only imagine. But literally, that word means crack in pieces. I think this is the only time that the Hebrew or Chaldee word that was used was translated as struggle together. Most of the other times it talks about something broken or something crushed. That it's something that's literally cracked into pieces. And just a couple examples was in Judges 9 and 53. It talks about how a woman dropped a stone on who was the king at the time, Abimelech, head, and it crushed his head. And then another time is in Psalm where it talks about Leviathan and talks about how his head is broken in pieces. So this isn't just like a little rolling about that, anyone who has children and maybe felt your wife's stomach as the children are in there and they roll about and you can kind of see it and that kind of thing. No, this was like, a severe, kind of tussling, like there was, something broken inside. So And the last thing that I brought out, or that I got from this section of Scripture, was we see, in all this, we see God's omniscience and his selection. In verse 23, it says, "And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from your bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger." Now, we see the omniscience because the kids have not been born. Jacob and Esau haven't been born, but yet God knows all of what's going to transpire before it even happens. So there you see the omniscience, but then you also see the selection, that even before they're even born, God has already determined that his favor is going to be with the younger. Now, at this time, obviously Jacob and Esau, the names aren't given yet. The children aren't born yet. They don't know who's going to be who. So theoretically, it could be either one that comes out. But we know through reading the Bible and what you've already read ahead, what's going to transpire. We already know who's selected. But at this time, Rebekah and Isaac don't know. They don't know anything. But the one thing I do want to ask is, did God pre-select based on actions? Was his selection based on actions?
What action?
What was that?
Did you mean, did he pick them because of something they had done?
Correct.
Or they were going to do? Because at this point they haven't been doing it yet, but he already knows what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So for me, when I was reading this, I was thinking, when Isaac prayed to God for his wife to get pregnant, I don't know that he asked for twins. And he probably didn't. He just wanted a child.
Right.
And then she finds out she's going to have 2. And then, they're constantly struggling in, I'm sure she had a really difficult pregnancy because they were doing that, constantly battling. I wondered if he doesn't force anybody to do the wrong thing. So I don't think that when he, this is the first case of almost artificial insemination. It's almost like that. But he creates 2, and he knows that one of them is there's always going to be a conflict between them, and that one of them, the 2 nations, Israel and I guess the Edomites, were always going to be at odds with each other. And I wasn't really sure to think, did he do that on purpose, or was that just a random thing that he was going to use the one he chose? And God tends to favor, or at least want to help, the underdog in a situation.
Right.
So he was going to, by doing what he was doing here, he was going against the culture. The culture of the firstborn gets a bigger share. So I'm thinking that it wasn't so much what they did, it's just that he was determined to use them. Absolutely. I think he just determined that he was going to use Jacob because Jacob valued things more than Esau would.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And that's what I wanted to bring out. I'll give it to you and I'll read it. And we're going to actually come back and use this at the end. But Romans 9:10 through 12. Romans chapter 9, 10 through 12. You don't have to turn there. I'll read it. It says, "And not only this, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one, even by our father Isaac, for the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth. It was said unto her, the elder shall serve the younger." And we have to understand that we are God-selected people if we've submitted ourselves to him. And yes, we took the confession of faith, but God selected us. You got to understand, we didn't find God. God found us. God wasn't lost. We were lost, and God found us. So that means that God selected you, and because of that, you gotta understand that we owe all. Not only do we owe all to Him, but when God selects, it's for purpose, just as Deacon Harry said. So with that, I want to go to the next section because, as usual, I'm talking quite a bit. So let's get through this section, and then I'll open up for questions or comments. I'll try to speed up a little bit. Would someone be so kind to read the second section titled "The Twins Are Born"? And I just want to read Genesis chapter 25, verses 24 to 28.
I'll read it, Brother Damien. Okay, I'll read the King James Version.
Okay.
And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red all over, like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. And the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man, dwelling in the tent. And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the first thing, we get a little bit of understanding that the names were of Esau and Jacob. They were given to them because of a little bit the characteristics that they displayed when they were born of Rebekah. That Esau literally means rough. It says he came out like a hairy garment, probably a rougher skin, a rougher touch, being all covered with hair. And then we hear about how Jacob had a hold of his heel. And Jacob, or I believe how it would have been pronounced when they called it, it would have been Jacob. It means heel catcher. That he was someone who would try to supplant or replace the position of someone else. Okay. Now, the thing that was interesting as I was finalizing my touches on this is like, okay, obviously God called the end from the beginning, so God knew all this already. But it was interesting that possibly both characteristics were likely in Isaac. Both characteristics from each one, because later, obviously in verse 27 talks about how Esau became a cunning hunter. Well, Esau likely learned hunting from Isaac. Interestingly enough, the Bible doesn't talk a whole lot. It doesn't, for whatever reason, doesn't talk a lot about Isaac. It talks a lot about. It talks a good bit about Abraham. It talks a lot about Jacob becoming Israel. It doesn't talk a whole lot about Isaac. But when Abraham and Isaac went out to go sacrifice to the Lord, like it was when it was that test, when God tested Abraham to give up Isaac, it doesn't say anything that this was like a surprise and Isaac didn't know what was going on. So it's likely that he knew some form of hunting from Abraham. And when Abraham saw the ram stuck in the bushes, it doesn't talk about there's any hesitation on him going over there, slaying it and going forward. So Isaac likely knew hunting from Abraham, which is why how Esau learned it, which tends to show why Isaac may have favored Esau because hunting was kind of part of his hobbies. The other part was Jacob likely learned a little bit of the supplanting through Isaac. Remember that Isaac, now it was according to promise, and Jacob was according to promise. But Isaac supplanted Ishmael. Ishmael was Abraham's first son, but he wasn't the one of promise. And it's possible that, again, I'm sure Isaac shared with Jacob things that transpired. So as well, just how Jacob learned a little bit of deception and practiced a little bit of deception, Isaac practiced a little bit of deception. He did the same thing that Abraham did in lying to a king about Rebekah being his sister. So some of the characteristics is, they say a lot, hey, you're just like your daddy. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that. But some of the characteristics of the father passed on. So anyway, now we learn also now about this trial. In the first section that we read, we learned that Isaac entreated for Rebekah because she was barren, and he did that when he was 40 years old. It says that Esau and Jacob now was born with him being 60 years old, or it says 70 years old in the King James Version in verse 26. So 20 years he was in this trial. And now Abraham is 160 years old, so the boys were only 15 years old when Abraham passed away. Now the other thing that we see for this is that their natures are now revealed. Again, I touched on a little bit earlier that we're in verse 27 that Esau talks about being a cunning or skilled hunter, skillful as it says in the New International Version. And interesting, in the King James Version, it talks about how Jacob was a plain man. In the New International Version, it doesn't really have a good translation or a good explanation of what it means to be a plain man. It just says, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Well, that part right there, we could say dwelling in tents. You could say that would be the interpretation that the New International Version gave. But the word plain is not interpreted. And so I looked that up, and the word plain there, it really means pious, that he was concerned of religious things. And perhaps because of that nature, that's why God favored him even before Esau. It's a little bit about how each one kind of tends to represent the two parts of man. That Esau was more the flesh part of man, and Jacob was more the spiritual part of man. Or you could even equate it heavenly versus earthly. So now this word plain in other parts is translated perfect. So like, for example, if you go to Job, where it talks about how the devil came and was talking to God, and God's like, hey, where you been? And you all walking to and fro through the earth. And God said, have you tried my servant Job, who is perfect? God described him as perfect. That word perfect is the same word plain. It's just translated perfect there, but here's translated plain. So I thought that was very interesting, and one for us to be one that's really important to the story that is actually missed a little bit in the New International Version.
Deacon Damien?
Yes.
I am glad you cleared that up, because when I read that, I thought it meant he was just a mama's boy. So I'm glad that you cleared that up for me. Plain.
And I thought that plain just kind of meant like, he was just kind of a simple guy. But God, under the unction of the Holy Spirit, had me look that up, and it's like, oh, there's more to this than just plain. So
right.
So anyhow, but that's what I mean by nature's revealed. And then the other thing, the last thing that really kind of stuck out to me in verse 28 is that you really kind of see the first, well, actually, it may not even be the first family dysfunction, but I call it the first family dysfunction. That you see how Isaac loves Esau and obviously shows some sort of favor towards him, and Rebekah loves Jacob and obviously shows some sort of favor towards him.
Right.
So we see this little bit of confusion going on, and we know that in 1 Corinthians 14 and 33 that God's not the author of confusion. But again, this story, it exposes some things, but it also exposes the nature of God and that how, even though we have dysfunction in our lives, we don't need to be discouraged by the dysfunction, because while God's not the author of it, that doesn't mean that he cannot operate in it. Matthew 9 and 12 really tells us, really kind of exemplifies that Jesus was telling them, they that be whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. So even in the midst of our dysfunction, God can operate if we will submit ourselves and allow him to do that, just like he did with Jacob. So now with that, I will pause and see if there's any questions or any comments, or if there's anything else anybody else got from the first two sections. Okay. I'll take the silence as everybody's content. We'll go to the last section, and then we'll wrap up and hopefully get out on time. Would there be someone kind enough to be one last reader for the section called Esau Sells His Birthright, reading verses 29 to 34?
I'll go ahead.
All right, thank you.
Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That is why he was also called Edom. Jacob replied, "First sell me your birthright." "Look, I am about to die," Esau said. "What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright.
All right, thank you. Okay. Now, as I was preparing for this, I have a Bible. I think it's called the Word Study Bible or the Keyword Bible, something like that. Keyword Study Bible is what it's called. And in there, it has a concordance built into it, and I think it has another section that I don't use a whole lot. I forget what it's called. But anyhow, it also has some commentary in there from whoever wrote this book. And it was interesting. In this one, he wrote about how a lot of people confuse the birthright and the blessing. And I thought it was really interesting because it does say here, obviously, that he stole his birthright, or Esau sold his birthright. But then later, as you keep reading, you see that Jacob also stole the blessing. And I think the author is correct, and I always looked at it as one and the same. But I think the author is correct because Esau, when the blessing was taken in Genesis chapter 27, you can read that on your own time. We don't have time to go through it now. But Esau said, "You have deceived me these 2 times." So the birthright was one time, and the blessing was another time. So I thought that was really interesting. The birthright is the double portion, the access to twice the amount of inheritance from the father as the other one gets. So he took that, and he also said it's the right to the title of the family name. That I guess essentially you're kind of the leader of the family name. But then later in Genesis 27, Jacob then also steals the blessing. So that's a little interesting tidbit there for you to look at on your own time. But want us to see the rash decision. So obviously, failed tests and poor decision made by Esau. The first thing that we learn from this is that he was fatigued. Says Esau came back from the field and he was faint. Or in the New International Version, came back from the open country and he was famished. Question for you: when did Satan come to Jesus the first time? When did Satan come to Jesus the first time?
When he was out, he had been fasting.
That's right. He was fasting. He was weakened. He was fatigued. And so I never really thought about this, but perhaps some of the trial, actually many of the trials that Jesus went through, many of them others had gone through and they had failed, and now we see that he's fulfilling. Hey, here's how you fight against these trials that come against you. But yeah, Esau's fatigue is number one, and so Satan potentially comes to him because of that. Now, the next thing we see that he was covetous. It says, and Esau said to Jacob, "Feed me, I pray you, with that same red pottage," or in the New International, he said, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." So he saw the red stew and became covetous of it. Now, is it wrong necessarily for him to want the red stew? No, it's not necessarily wrong for him to want the red stew, but for the trade at which he gave, it was a incorrect desire. And then we see finally that he was imprudent. Prudent means that you make decisions based on the impacts of the future. Now, he says, obviously Jacob says, "Sell me this day your birthright." And Esau said, "Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me?" Or in the New International, "Look, I'm about to die." Esau said, "What good is the birthright to me?" He was thinking for the now. He wasn't thinking about the future. He was thinking only in the moment. Where the reality was that he wasn't about to die. He would have been just fine. But he had that fleshly nature, gave in to that fleshly nature. Jacob had the more spiritual nature, desired the thing of the spiritual nature, and so they made a swap, and the birthright has been sold. Now, the last part that I really want to bring out from this is God's election is fulfilled. Obviously, in the first section that we read, we learned about how God didn't say he was going to place his favor on, but it's implied that when he says the elder shall serve the younger, and one people shall be stronger than the other people, that's an implication that God's going to yield his blessing upon the younger instead of the older, even though at that time he doesn't outright say it. Now, regardless, we have to understand that God's word does not come back to him void. I'm sure you all have heard that. What God has already stated is going to happen. Now, my question is, was Jacob righteous in his act, in the way that he went about doing this?
No.
Right. Go ahead. Oh, I thought someone was saying something. I did hear a faint note, and I agree.
I said no, and then we saw that Jacob later on did pay for his actions because he was a little trickster.
Absolutely. Because of his trickery, later on he had to go through the same type of trickery from Laban.
Right.
And he was basically not just because of this, but because he stole the blessing later, he was more or less banished from his family. Not banished, but he was sent away from his family. experienced the loss of a brother, and then later had to show acts of repentance to Esau. He had to make what was wrong right. But I agree with you 100%. He was not right. Even though God wanted him to get the birthright, God didn't need him to do that to get it in that way. Again, God's word does not come back to him void. So he doesn't have to step out. We don't have to step out in a sinful way to get God to accomplish what he needs to accomplish. He'll make it happen in his own way, in his own timing. But nonetheless, God honored it. Again, coming back to that, God winked at sin. But Luke 3:11 says, he answereth and saith unto them, this is Jesus talking, he that hath two coats, this is John the Baptist talking about how you should carry out repentance. And it says, he that hath two coats, let him impart to him that hath none, and he that hath meat, let him do likewise. Jacob should have said, okay, you're hungry, you need food, I'll give you food. And should have just done it. So certainly the way that he did this barter exchange was not right. Now, I believe that Esau, according to the way the Bible explains it, was more wrong than what Jacob was, because it says he didn't care for the things of God, but they were both wrong. And so then the next question then becomes, so if Jacob was wrong, then why did God honor it?
I struggle with the fact that, like in Malachi, the book of Malachi, chapter 1, where God say he loved Jacob and he hated Esau.
Yes. And
I struggle with that because it's like, the way they put it was like, in the womb he knew what they were going to be like. So I didn't understand that part, in Malachi, where he hated Esau and loved Jacob.
Yeah.
I think that God honored it because he had already made that prophecy. And I think that, because he saw what Jacob was capable of, and because he also saw that Jacob had that spirituality about him, I think that, ultimately God's will is going to be done. And so he was going to use Jacob for his purpose ultimately. But yeah, I think that, Jacob being a trickster, that really just affected how how his blessing or his future was going to come about, him having to get hustled by Laban ultimately. He may have avoided that altogether if he'd have done or let God, do what God was intending to do initially. But yeah, I think that's why God went on and blessed the way he did, because that was his intention. It was supposed to happen.
Absolutely. I agree with you. And Carol, I'm gonna come back to your statement. I can't give you, I'd say, a perfect answer, but I'll give you what I have as far as insight into the nature of God. But I agree with you, LaShawn, that Isaiah 46:10 says, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. From the beginning, God declared what was going to happen. Right. And because he declared it, again, his word doesn't come back to him void. So it's going to come to pass. This is God's will. Once God speaks it, it's done. Even though it may not be done in the physical, it's already done, as they say, in the spiritual. It's already done. So now it's just a matter of the process of time before it comes to pass, for it to physically manifest. And why does God do it that way? Well, I can't fully answer that, but it's just according to God's timing. Everything is according to God's timing. And I want to use that a little bit as a encouragement for us that God has given us favor. God has promised to get us through our trials, and everything is according to His timing, but we have to remain faithful in that. But before I go to the last section, I want to come back because you do bring up a very challenging question for us, Carol, where you talk about how is it that neither of the boys have done anything. They're not born yet, but God's made it this way and has already seen that Esau's going to be that way. And it really comes down to, there's a scripture, I didn't look it up. I can if you need me to. There's actually two references. There's one, I believe in Jeremiah, where I think Jeremiah is watching the person with the clay, and he has power over the clay, forming it into this type of vessel. And then there's a New Testament reference about how, I know Paul wrote it, I can't remember if it was to the Romans or the Corinthians, I think it might have been to the Romans, where he talks about God has power over the clay. We're the clay. So he can make one vessel of honor in Jacob, he can make one vessel of dishonor in Esau. Just like how, and as you read through it, it talks about how he made and raised up Pharaoh in Exodus for the purposes of displaying his power. The Bible says that he hardened Pharaoh's heart. He didn't make Pharaoh do what Pharaoh did, but he set the conditions and placed in him this nature for whatever reason, just so that he could, display his power. So that's why I can't really say, well, why does he do this? I can't fully say, but what we do know is that he has power to make vessels of honor and vessels of dishonor. And for whatever reason, he chose Esau to be the vessel of dishonor. But there's some things, like Pastor says, there's some things that we don't know, we don't understand, but we just have to trust and believe God's word, that there is no unrighteousness in God. And this is actually a great segue into the last section that I wrote, coming back to Romans chapter 9, and we're going to read verses 14 to 16. The last part that I wrote was election and mercy. Election and mercy. Remember, I opened up that it's because of God's mercies we're not consumed. Well, it is a great thing. This is a message for us. It's also a message for the unbeliever, that it is unspeakably phenomenal to be one that is elected, one that is selected by God. It almost seems unfair, but it's just such a blessing to be underneath God's care, to be one that he has selected. But Romans 9:14-16 says, what shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? God forbid. Is there unrighteousness with God because he has chosen to do these things? No, absolutely not. There is absolutely no unrighteousness with God. Continuing on. For he saith to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So then it is not of him that willeth, nor of him that runneth, but of God that showeth mercy. And that's really the best answer that I can give to you, Carol. So hopefully that says a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's all up to God on whom he decides to show mercy. And again, that's a message also to the unbeliever. Mercy, we have to understand, or you as an unbeliever have to understand there's a limit to mercy. There's going to be a time of death. And at that time of death, if you're not in right standing with God, mercy is done. But when you are elected of God, when you choose to become a believer, or submit yourself, I should say that, when you choose to submit yourself to the will of God, then nothing separates us from him. And that's really the lesson that I prepared for today. Are there any other questions, any other observations, or did anybody else get anything else from the lesson that we read?
So these two nations became the Muslims and the Christians, the two nations that he talked about?
Fundamentally, yes. Obviously, there are other religions that really kind of spurred off from there, like Muslim, Nation of Islam, and others. But yeah, predominantly it became the Muslims. Well, actually, it became three, as Harry talked about last week. It became the Muslims from Edom or Esau. It became the Christians, and it became the Judaizers. Because there are still obviously people who are of Israeli descent that still have not submitted themselves to Jesus Christ, and they follow Judaism. Any other questions or comments from anyone?
When Carol mentioned that in Malachi that God hated Esau, that term when in Hebrew, they often use the word hate when there's a preference. That when someone has a preference for one over another, they would use that word in its place.
So hate word.
Yeah, because God didn't hate Esau. He preferred Jacob.
Yes.
Because he saw the arc of their lives, and he saw one was an instant gratification type person, that would have been Esau, and another one valued spiritual things a little bit more, and that would have been Jacob. And Jacob made a lot of mistakes in his life, like we all do, but God can use you anyway. He can work through the mistake.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Well, that really concludes our lesson.